The airport bustled with the frenetic energy of early morning travelers. The hum of rolling suitcases, the brisk footsteps of hurried passengers, and the distant, disembodied voices echoing through the terminal announcing gate changes and weather delays filled the air. It was another rainy morning, and the heavy clouds outside gave the airport windows a dull, gray hue, intensifying the fluorescent brightness of the interior. At Gate 32, Jasmine Rivers, a recently promoted black female pilot in her early 30s, was preparing for the flight she'd soon captain. The pride she felt at earning her pilot's stripes shone through in her calm, confident manner, even in the midst of morning travel chaos. With her tailored navy blue uniform and neatly arranged hair beneath her cap, she moved with an air of authority and poise that turned a few heads as she strode past. Jasmine had long dreamed of reaching this level. She knew the journey hadn't been easy, but every obstacle had pushed her to become more resilient, a necessity in a field where female pilots, especially black female pilots, were still rare. Today marked one of her first flights as a lead pilot, and despite the heavy storm clouds, she felt a calm readiness. All she had to do now was wait for her final crew briefing before boarding. Meanwhile, Karen Thompson stood at the check-in counter, sighing dramatically as the attendant scanned her boarding pass. She was a middle-aged white woman with an impeccably styled blonde bob, her attire perfectly coordinated in shades of white and beige, completed with a designer scarf. Her tightly clutched handbag, monogrammed with gold initials, announced her preference for exclusivity. Karen was on her way to attend a wedding, but delays threatened her tight schedule, a fact she made clear with every impatient tap of her manicured nails. As she retrieved her ticket, her eyes happened to land on Jasmine, who was standing a few feet away. The sight made Karen's brow furrow instantly. Her gaze lingered on Jasmine, noting her captain's stripes. She turned back to the attendant, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I suppose the airlines are letting anyone fly these days," she muttered, though loud enough for Jasmine to hear. Jasmine caught the comment, her composure unfazed. Over the years, she'd become used to the whispers, the narrowed eyes, the questioning glances, and the dismissive attitudes. Yet today, the remark struck a particular nerve. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was the last thing she wanted to deal with before such an important flight. Ignoring Karen's stare, Jasmine turned to head toward the staff lounge for her final briefing. But as she walked away, she felt Karen's scrutinizing gaze burning into her back. Jasmine took a slow breath, pushing the woman's judgment aside. She couldn't afford any distractions today, especially not from someone like Karen. As the boarding announcement for Flight 294 crackled over the loudspeaker, Karen huffed, gathering her carry-on and strolling toward the gate. She breezed past other passengers, eager to find her first-class seat and settle in. She loved the perks of priority boarding and reveled in every privilege her premium ticket afforded her. Yet the closer she came to the gate, the more her irritation grew. The gate agent scanned her ticket, and as Karen stepped into the bridge leading to the aircraft, she saw Jasmine standing at the entryway, greeting passengers. Karen's eyes widened, and she stopped dead in her tracks. "Excuse me," she said, addressing a nearby flight attendant. "Is that?" She pointed at Jasmine. "Is she?" The pilot, her voice was filled with incredulity. The attendant, caught off guard by Karen's tone, nodded politely. "Yes, that's Captain Jasmine Rivers. She'll be flying us today." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, and she shook her head slightly. "I don't think this is safe." "I'd like to speak to someone in charge," she demanded, her voice edging into a high-pitched insistence. The flight attendant maintained her composure. "Captain Rivers is one of our most highly trained pilots, ma'am. You're in very capable hands." But Karen wasn't satisfied. No, I've been flying for years, and I've never seen." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I just don't feel comfortable with this. I need to speak to a manager or something." As the flight attendant tried to calm Karen, Jasmine couldn't help but overhear. Jasmine turned, catching the woman's eye with a steady, unblinking look. She decided to address Karen directly, even though she was under no obligation to do so. "Ma'am, I assure you that you're in safe hands," Jasmine said, her voice steady and professional. "I've been trained for this, and I take every passenger's safety seriously." Karen stared back, eyes narrowed. "Do you now?" "I'm just not sure I can trust that," she retorted. "I don't know how someone like you even managed to get this position." The words hung heavily in the air. Several nearby passengers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the undertone of Karen's statement. Jasmine took a measured breath, steadying herself before responding. I understand your concern, Ma, but I promise you I wouldn't be here if I wasn't qualified. This flight is my responsibility, and I won't let anything compromise it. Karen's mouth twisted into a smirk. We'll see about that, she muttered under her breath, making her way to her seat. Once Karen was settled in her seat, her irritation only grew. She muttered complaints to herself, throwing pointed glances at the crew members. As more passengers boarded, she observed their interactions, scrutinizing every movement. She refused to believe she was the only one uncomfortable with this situation. A young mother with her son sat across the aisle from Karen, and as she adjusted her child's seatbelt, she noticed Karen's scowl. Karen leaned over, whispering conspiratorially, "Can you believe they'd let just anyone fly these days? It's like standards don't matter anymore." The mother looked taken aback, but she remained polite. "I trust the airline to hire qualified professionals," she replied, a touch of firmness in her tone. She turned her attention back to her son, clearly wanting to end the conversation. Karen huffed, dissatisfied. She sat back in her seat, her annoyance deepening. She whispered loud enough for others nearby to hear, "This is just ridiculous. I'm not going to risk my life for their social experiments." A few passengers shot her disapproving glances, but Karen remained oblivious, absorbed in her mounting indignation. She couldn't shake the unease she felt, though her concern had little to do with safety and everything to do with her own discomfort with Jasmine as the pilot. In the cockpit, Jasmine and her co-pilot, a seasoned white male named Frank, ran through their pre-flight checks. Frank had worked with Jasmine before and held nothing but respect for her abilities. He could tell she was focused yet unsettled. "You okay?" Frank asked, glancing over. Jasmine gave him a reassuring nod. "Yeah, just dealing with some of the usual," she replied, a hint of frustration in her voice. Frank nodded knowingly. "People can be something else, can't they? But don't let it get to you. You've earned your place here." Jasmine's shoulders relaxed slightly. She took a steadying breath, reaffirming her resolve. "Thanks, Frank. I'm ready to get this bird in the air." As they wrapped up their checks, the flight attendant informed them of the boarding status. Jasmine was ready, her mind focused on the flight ahead. She couldn't afford distractions, especially with the turbulent weather conditions on the radar. It was going to be a challenging flight, but she was prepared. In the cabin, Karen's irritation had reached a boiling point. As the crew announced final boarding, she decided to make one last attempt to voice her dissatisfaction. She signaled for a flight attendant, who approached with a polite smile. "Is there something I can assist you with, ma'am?" Karen leaned forward, her face etched with frustration. I still don't feel comfortable. I don't think someone like her should be flying this plane. I've never heard of people like her in this position." The flight attendant's polite smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her professionalism. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but please rest assured Captain Rivers is fully qualified and highly respected by our airline." Karen crossed her arms, shaking her head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," she muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'll be filing a complaint after this flight. You can count on that." The flight attendant nodded, choosing not to engage further. "If there's nothing else, I'll take my leave, ma'am. We'll be departing shortly." As the flight attendant walked away, Karen glanced around, meeting the gazes of a few passengers who'd overheard her. Some looked away, clearly uncomfortable, while others gave her reproachful stares. Yet Karen didn't back down. She felt entirely justified in her indignation. With all passengers finally seated, Jasmine and Frank prepared for takeoff. Jasmine's hands were steady on the controls as they began taxiing toward the runway. Her focus was absolute. She'd been through too much to let anyone or anything shake her confidence now. The engines roared as the plane accelerated down the runway. Jasmine felt the familiar rush as the wheels lifted from the ground, the plane ascending into the stormy sky. She and Frank maintained calm communication as they navigated through patches of turbulence, both fully engaged with the task at hand. Back in the cabin, Karen clutched her armrests, her expression a mix of frustration and anxiety. She muttered under her breath as the plane leveled off, her eyes flickering to the cockpit door. as if hoping it would swing open and reveal someone she deemed more suitable for the job. The young mother across the aisle caught Karen's eye and, sensing the tension, spoke up. I think it's pretty amazing to have someone like Captain Rivers flying this plane. It gives my son someone to look up to. Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. Someone to look up to. We'll see about that, she muttered dismissively, turning away. She refused to engage further, closing her eyes and leaning back, a sour expression fixed on her face. But despite her disdain, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that today's flight would be one she'd remember, not for the reasons she expected, but because of an experience that would test every one of her assumptions. As the plane settled into cruising altitude, a sense of calm washed over the cabin. Passengers adjusted in their seats, some dozing off, others chatting quietly or scrolling through their phones. The flight attendants moved down the aisles, checking on passengers and handing out snacks and drinks. Despite the calm on the surface, a storm brewed within the plane, not only in the form of turbulent weather, but within the attitude of one particular passenger. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her first-class seat. She glanced around, her eyes narrow, still bitter over what she considered an incompetent choice for her pilot. She shot furtive glances toward the cockpit door, almost as if she expected someone to emerge and reassure her that this was all some kind of mistake. The storm outside was forecasted to hit intermittently, and Jasmine and her co-pilot, Frank, were already monitoring the radar closely. They anticipated some rough patches, which Jasmine knew would require every ounce of focus. She steadied herself, intent on proving, if only to herself, that she was capable of leading her crew and passengers safely through the skies. In the cabin, a voice came over the intercom. It was Jasmine, making a standard announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rivers speaking. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet and are expecting some light turbulence ahead due to the weather patterns moving through the area. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and as always, we appreciate your cooperation. Thank you for flying with us, and we'll do our best to make this a smooth and comfortable journey." Most passengers returned to their activities without much thought, but Karen was visibly bristling, her body tense. She turned to the flight attendant, who was now collecting empty cups and wrappers from the first-class cabin. "Excuse me," she said, her tone impatient. "Can you tell me why the captain thinks she can handle this turbulence? This is no time for experiments." The flight attendant's face betrayed a flicker of surprise, though she recovered quickly. "Captain Rivers is well trained to handle all conditions, ma'am. Please try to relax and enjoy the flight." Karen wasn't satisfied. "No, I'd like a direct answer. How many flights has she even been on? What is her experience level?" The flight attendant kept her composure, though her patience wore thin. "Captain Rivers is fully qualified, and I assure you we're all in safe hands." With an audible scoff, Karen shook her head. "I'll be the judge of that," she muttered, her voice just loud enough to be heard by the passengers around her. A few turned to look, discomfort evident on their faces. Jasmine remained focused in the cockpit, adjusting the controls as she and Frank navigated through the storm. The plane rocked slightly, and the fasten seatbelt sign illuminated again. In the cabin, passengers felt the plane shudder as it entered a particularly rough patch. Karen clutched her armrests, her knuckles turning white. Her agitation grew with every shake and dip of the plane. She muttered complaints under her breath, her eyes darting toward the cockpit door. Across the aisle, the young mother with her son watched Karen's growing discomfort. She glanced at Karen, clearly unsettled but unwilling to ignore the tension in the air. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Are you all right? The turbulence is normal in weather like this." Karen looked at the mother with an exasperated expression. "Normal? There's nothing normal about this. And I'm not sure how anyone can feel comfortable knowing who's in charge up there." The mother's eyes narrowed, her expression growing firm. "With all due respect, you might want to trust that the airline knows what they're doing when they select their pilots." Karen let out a short, derisive laugh. "Trust? Oh, I've trusted them before, but they never pull stunts like this. This pilot is completely out of her depth, and I, for one, am not going to sit here quietly if my safety is on the line." A few other passengers began to listen in, growing increasingly uncomfortable with Karen's loud complaints. One man, a few rows ahead, turned to Karen and added his voice to the growing tension. "Ma'am, maybe you should try to relax. This flight has a fully trained crew, and you're not helping anyone by complaining." Karen's eyes flared with indignation. "I'm sorry, but I didn't realize safety concerns were now classified as complaints," she retorted. "If you want to put your life in the hands of an unqualified person, that's your choice. But I paid good money for this ticket, and I have every right to speak my mind." The flight attendant approached again, sensing the growing unrest. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. Other passengers are getting concerned, and we want to ensure everyone has a comfortable experience." Karen, now visibly irate, threw her hands up. "A comfortable experience? This is about more than comfort. I've flown countless times, and I've never had to deal with this kind of irresponsibility. How did someone like her even get this job?" The young mother, unable to stay silent any longer, leaned forward. "Someone like her? Really? Why don't you just say what you mean?" Karen sneered, folding her arms. "Oh, don't play that card. You know exactly what I mean. If the airline is going to put unqualified people in charge just to appease some diversity quota, they should at least have the decency to inform us." The mother's expression turned to one of controlled anger. "You're out of line. She's qualified more so than most people I know, I'm sure." By now, other passengers murmured disapprovingly, casting irritated glances at Karen. But Karen seemed emboldened, her voice growing louder. "You can all be as self-righteous as you want, but I have the right to feel safe. This is outrageous, and I'll be making sure the airline hears all about it." The flight attendant tried once more to intervene, her tone more assertive. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down, or I'll have no choice but to report this behavior." Karen, now visibly seething, looked the attendant up and down with disdain. "Oh, so now I'm the problem? Unbelievable. This is what happens when standards are compromised. You can all thank me later when this so-called pilot brings us down safely, if that's even possible." The mother's young son, who had been listening quietly, looked up at his mom and whispered, "Why is she being so mean?" The mother's face softened as she looked down at her son. "Some people just don't understand that everyone deserves respect, honey." Karen overheard the comment, her face reddening. "Respect? How am I supposed to respect someone who doesn't even deserve to be up there?" she snapped, louder than ever. A man seated nearby couldn't hold back any longer. "Enough. We all heard you. Now, can you please just let the rest of us have a peaceful flight?" Karen shot him a furious glare, her voice trembling with indignation. "You know what, maybe I will. But mark my words, something goes wrong, and it'll be on all of you for pretending this is okay." As if to underscore Karen's complaints, the plane hit another pocket of turbulence, shaking more violently this time. Passengers gripped their armrests, a few gasping as the plane dipped momentarily before steadying. Jasmine's voice came over the intercom, her tone calm but serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a bit more turbulence as we pass through this weather system. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We expect to be through it shortly. Thank you for your patience." Karen clenched her jaw, a look of vindication flashing in her eyes. She glanced around as if to say, "See, I told you so." However, the other passengers largely ignored her now, clearly tired of her attitude. Many of them seemed reassured by Jasmine's calm professionalism, contrasting sharply with Karen's escalating hysteria. In the cockpit, Jasmine continued to navigate through the storm, her focus unbroken. She could feel the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders but kept her hands steady on the controls. Frank, who had been monitoring her closely, spoke up. "You're handling this like a pro, Jasmine. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jasmine allowed herself a brief smile. "Thanks, Frank. Sometimes people like that, it's like they can't even imagine that I deserve to be here. But they don't know what it took to get here." Frank nodded, his voice empathetic. "The ones who matter know. And the ones who don't, well, they're just noise." Jasmine's grip on the controls remained firm as they exited the rough patch, the skies ahead clear. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, strengthened by Frank's words. She wasn't here to prove herself to people like Karen, she was here to do the job she had trained for, and that was exactly what she intended to do. Back in the cabin, the tension slowly began to dissipate as the turbulence eased and the plane flew into calmer skies. The passengers seemed relieved, some returning to their previous activities, while others cast wary glances at Karen, who now sat fuming in silence. The flight attendant approached Karen once more, her voice firm but polite. "Ma'am, I'm going to remind you that any further disruption could result in consequences. This is your final warning." Karen glared, folding her arms. She muttered something under her breath, but stayed silent, her frustration palpable. Across the aisle, the young mother gave her son a comforting smile and handed him a book. She caught Karen's eye for a brief moment and, despite everything, gave her a look of compassion. "You know," the mother said gently, her tone free of judgment, "sometimes it's good to give people a chance. You might be surprised by what they're capable of." Karen scowled, unwilling to respond, but the mother's words lingered with her, a small, irritating whisper in the back of her mind. The turbulence had died down, but the tension on board Flight 294 was only growing worse. Karen continued to sit in her seat, fuming, her arms crossed as she glared at the passengers around her, who had dared to defend Jasmine. Though her surroundings were quieting, she was far from done. Her indignation had intensified, now morphing into something darker, something almost manic as she stewed in her frustration. Minutes passed, and she finally couldn't take it anymore. Without a second thought, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, ignoring the seatbelt sign flashing above. Her movement caught the attention of the flight attendants, who approached quickly, signaling for her to sit back down. But Karen brushed them off, her mind set on confronting Jasmine directly. One of the attendants stepped in her path, blocking her from advancing down the aisle. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat. The captain has requested all passengers remain seated." Karen looked the attendant up and down, her disdain clear. "Do you think I care what that so-called captain wants? She shouldn't even be up there. This whole flight is a farce, and I'm not going to sit quietly and pretend it's normal." The flight attendant took a steadying breath. "Ma'am, please. You're causing a disturbance, and this is the last time we'll ask you to return to your seat." Karen's voice grew louder. "You don't get to tell me what to do. I paid for my ticket, and I have the right to feel safe." Her voice carried through the cabin, drawing the attention of more and more passengers. Many exchanged uncomfortable looks, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. The air was thick with unease, the kind that felt ready to snap at any moment. Ignoring the attendant's plea, Karen pushed past her and stormed toward the cockpit, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. When she reached the door, she pounded on it, shouting, "Open up. I demand to speak to the captain. Open this door right now." Inside the cockpit, Jasmine and Frank heard the commotion clearly. Frank looked over at Jasmine, worry in his eyes, but Jasmine maintained her composure, her jaw tightening. She had been trained to handle all sorts of disruptions on flights, but she had never encountered a passenger as unhinged as this one. "We should call security upon landing," Frank suggested quietly, trying to offer support. "She's disrupting the entire flight." Jasmine nodded, her voice steady. "Let's focus on keeping everything safe until then." She turned back to the controls, though the pounding on the door made it hard to concentrate. Outside, Karen continued to hammer on the door, yelling loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I know you can hear me. This is unbelievable. I have every right to know who's flying this plane. You owe me an explanation." A flight attendant finally managed to wedge herself between Karen and the door, trying to get her to step back. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. If you don't stop, we'll have no choice but to restrain you." Karen whipped around, fury burning in her eyes. "Restrain me? You're going to restrain me for wanting a safe flight? You people are out of your minds." At that moment, a man from economy class, who had come up to investigate the noise, stepped in to try and calm Karen down. "Look, everyone here just wants a peaceful flight. Let's all just go back to our seats, okay?" Karen rounded on him, her anger boiling over. "Don't you tell me what to do. None of you have the right to tell me anything. This is about my safety." Her voice cracked with hysteria, and the passengers around her shrank back, alarmed. In a final act of rage, Karen raised her hand and, without warning, swung it forward, connecting with the arm of the flight attendant, who had been trying to keep her calm. The slap echoed through the cabin, leaving the flight attendant stunned, her cheek red from the impact. Gasps filled the air, and the passengers around Karen froze, their eyes wide with shock. A few people immediately started filming, capturing Karen's assault on video. The young mother from earlier leaned down to shield her child's eyes, shaking her head in disbelief. The flight attendant, regaining her composure, took a step back, her voice steady but firm. "That's it. You've assaulted a member of the crew. You will be arrested." Upon landing, she motioned to two other attendants, who began moving forward to restrain Karen. But Karen wasn't done. Her face flushed with anger, she pointed a finger at Jasmine, whom she couldn't even see but somehow blamed for everything that had happened. This is all her fault. She should never have been allowed to fly this plane in the first place. She's a disgrace, and you're all too afraid to admit it. The attendants moved swiftly, guiding Karen firmly but carefully back to her seat and securing her arms with soft restraints to prevent her from causing further disruption. She thrashed briefly but eventually subsided, muttering bitterly under her breath, her once proud demeanor reduced to a spectacle of rage and denial. As Karen sat, subdued but still visibly seething, the passengers began murmuring amongst themselves, expressing a mixture of relief and disbelief. The young mother, her voice barely a whisper, turned to her son. "Remember, sweetheart, people should be treated with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like." The man who had tried to calm Karen down shook his head as he returned to his seat, glancing back once at her with a look of disappointment. "Some people just don't get it," he muttered. Meanwhile, Jasmine remained focused, though she was well aware of the chaos that had unfolded just outside the cockpit door. Despite the tension, she kept her hands steady, guiding the plane through the skies with the same unbreakable resolve she had shown throughout her career. She was determined not to let Karen's actions shake her, even though she knew the incident would stay with her long after the flight was over. As the plane finally began its descent, Jasmine and Frank prepared for landing, exchanging a quick nod. They both knew that what awaited them on the ground would be far from routine. When Flight 294 touched down, the plane taxied to the gate, and the seatbelt sign turned off. But before any passengers could stand, a group of security personnel boarded, moving swiftly down the aisle toward Karen's seat. Karen, seeing them approach, straightened up, her defiance once again flaring as she looked each of them in the eye. "You're making a big mistake," she hissed as they undid her restraints, preparing to escort her off the plane. "I'll have all of your jobs for this. You have no idea who you're dealing with." One of the officers ignored her outburst, his face impassive as he led her toward the exit. As Karen passed down the aisle, the passengers watched, some openly relieved, others quietly shaking their heads. The young mother from earlier couldn't help but give a small, satisfied nod, whispering a few reassuring words to her son. Karen, however, held her head high as she was escorted off the plane, her pride bruised but far from broken. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, flashes from nearby cell phones and cameras met her, documenting the spectacle she had created. Back in the cockpit, Jasmine took a steadying breath, allowing herself a moment to reflect as the passengers began to disembark. She knew she would likely be asked to provide a statement about the incident, and though the experience had been exhausting, she felt a quiet sense of triumph. She had remained professional, composed, and unshaken, even in the face of Karen's blatant hostility. As the last of the passengers filed out, Frank placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a supportive smile. "You did a fantastic job today, Jasmine. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Jasmine returned his smile, a glimmer of pride shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Frank. I won't." In the terminal, Karen's fate was already being decided as security prepared to escort her further for questioning. Yet she couldn't resist one final, parting glare back toward the plane, her thoughts simmering with indignation. But the impact of her actions was now out of her control, and the truth of what she had done would be exposed for everyone to see. As Jasmine exited the plane, she was greeted by a small group of airline staff who had heard about the incident. They offered her words of support and encouragement, some even applauding her for her resilience. For the first time since the flight began, Jasmine allowed herself to truly feel the weight of what she had endured, a mixture of relief and vindication washing over her. One of the airline representatives approached her, smiling warmly. "Captain Rivers, you handled this with extraordinary professionalism. I hope you know that we all have the utmost respect for you." Jasmine nodded, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you. It means a lot." As she walked away, a few passengers stopped her, offering quiet words of thanks and admiration for how she had conducted herself. Jasmine knew that while she may not have changed Karen's mind, she had shown the rest of the world what it truly meant to stand tall in the face of adversity. As Karen was led away by security through the bustling terminal, passengers who had disembarked from Flight 294 watched in a mixture of awe and quiet satisfaction. Some murmured about her behavior, others shook their heads, recalling the shocking moment she lashed out at the flight attendant. The tension from the flight lingered, with passengers recounting the chaos to friends and family who waited at the gate, the incident already spreading as people shared videos they'd captured on their phones. Inside the terminal, a small crowd gathered, captivated by Karen's defiant stance even as she was taken to a private room for questioning. The usual hum of activity at the airport paused as people stopped to watch the spectacle. Karen's face, flushed with anger and bruised pride, was still twisted in disbelief. To her, this entire situation was a grotesque misunderstanding. She was, in her mind, merely a concerned passenger who had been wronged. In the room, a security officer, a tall man with a calm yet firm demeanor, entered, his eyes observing Karen with a level stare. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her gaze, defiant and accusatory, met his without a hint of remorse. The officer began in a measured tone. We've received reports of disruptive and violent behavior from multiple witnesses on your flight. We're here to discuss the consequences of your actions. Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. Consequences? For what? Speaking up when I felt unsafe, her voice was a sneer, edged with entitlement. The officer's face remained neutral. This has gone beyond a simple complaint. Assaulting a flight attendant, as well as refusing to comply with safety instructions, is a serious offense. We have video evidence from several passengers, and we take these incidents very seriously. Karen's expression flickered with a brief flash of fear, quickly replaced by indignation. You people are unbelievable. I was trying to protect myself and the other passengers. I did what anyone in my position would do. The officer's patience wore thin. Your actions endangered the safety of everyone on board. That's not acceptable under any circumstance. I'm going to need you to remain here while we process a report. As the officer turned to leave the room, Karen clenched her fists, her mouth pressed into a tight line. She muttered under her breath, the fire of her anger simmering but contained, unable to lash out as she'd done on the plane. This was a world she couldn't control, one that pushed back against her entitlement and now forced her to face consequences she never expected. Outside, word of the incident continued to spread. Clips of Karen's tirade and assault had already made their way online, with viewers sharing and commenting on her behavior. By the time the video gained traction, her actions had ignited a firestorm of reaction across social media. The hashtags Flight 294 meltdown and Stand with Captain Rivers began trending, with thousands of users chiming in to support Jasmine and call out Karen's behavior. Many passengers who had witnessed the event firsthand took to social media to offer their perspective, sharing their gratitude for Jasmine's professionalism in handling such a tense situation. Some even praised the flight attendants who'd bravely intervened, their posts lauding the calm and respectful handling of Karen's outburst. As Jasmine walked through the terminal toward the airline's crew lounge, she found herself approached by a few passengers from the flight who had lingered to speak with her. They offered words of encouragement and thanked her for getting them through the storm safely despite the difficult circumstances. A mother who had been seated in the row across from Karen approached Jasmine, her young son clinging to her side. "Captain Rivers," she began, her voice soft but earnest, "I just want to thank you. My son was frightened by what happened, but you kept us all safe. I don't think we'll ever forget that." Jasmine's professional facade softened, and she knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. She offered him a gentle smile. "Thank you for flying with me," she said kindly. "You're very brave to handle all of that so well. I'm glad you and your mom are safe." The boy's eyes widened as he looked at Jasmine, awe evident in his gaze. "Are you a superhero?" he asked in a shy whisper. Jasmine chuckled, warmth spreading across her face. "Not quite," she replied, "but I'm here to make sure you're always safe when you fly." The mother smiled, touched by Jasmine's kindness. "We're lucky to have people like you in the skies. You made a difference today." As they left, Jasmine stood, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She had trained for years to reach this position, to break barriers not just for herself but for others who might one day follow in her footsteps. Today had been a stark reminder of why that was important. Her resilience had been tested, but she had stood firm. Meanwhile, back in the private room, Karen's questioning had concluded, and security had decided to release her temporarily while charges were reviewed. A stern warning had been issued, and she would receive further notice of any fines or legal proceedings. As Karen exited, her face still flushed with anger, she felt the eyes of the public on her, a mixture of disapproval and curiosity in their gazes. She kept her head down, fuming as she made her way out of the terminal. She could feel her phone buzzing in her purse, and when she finally checked, messages from family, friends, and acquaintances filled her screen. She scrolled through dozens of texts, the tone of which varied from shock to disappointment, and even outrage. One message from her sister stood out. "Karen, what on earth were you thinking? You've embarrassed the family." Karen's jaw tightened. She wasn't ready to face the scrutiny, nor did she feel remorse. To her, the world had simply misinterpreted her actions. She was the victim, at least in her mind, and she held firm to that narrative. But the consequences were far from over. By the time she made it home, Karen's social media profiles had exploded with mentions, many of them critical, and she was being tagged in posts calling out her behavior. Her employer had already sent her an email, stating they were aware of the incident and would be discussing her future employment pending a review. As the reality of her situation settled in, Karen's defiance began to waver. She felt her world shrinking, and the certainty she had once held started to crumble under the weight of public backlash. Back at the airport, Jasmine finally sat down in the quiet of the crew lounge, exhausted but relieved to have the flight behind her. As she sipped a cup of tea, her phone began to buzz with messages from friends, family, and even a few colleagues who had heard about the incident. She smiled as she read messages of support, each one lifting her spirits a little higher. Jasmine's sister had sent a voice message, her voice brimming with pride. "I saw the videos, Jazz. You handled it with so much grace. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are. We're all so proud of you." Jasmine's heart swelled with gratitude. She knew the path she had chosen wasn't easy, but moments like these reminded her of why she persisted. She was making a difference, both in the air and on the ground, and if she had to endure a few more Karens along the way, she was ready. The incident had pushed her to her limits, but Jasmine felt a renewed sense of pride, knowing she had stayed true to her values. She had risen above the hate and prejudice, showing the world that dignity and resilience would always soar higher than ignorance. And as she looked out at the busy airport terminal beyond the lounge window, she felt a sense of calm. For Jasmine, this was only the beginning, and her journey as a pilot and a trailblazer was far from over. The impact of the incident on Flight 294 was fast, furious, and unrelenting. By the time Karen made it home that night, her phone was buzzing incessantly, with notifications piling up across social media and news alerts filling her inbox. Footage of her outburst on the flight had gone viral, reaching major news outlets. News headlines labeled her the disruptive passenger or the airline Karen, and hashtags like "Karen on a plane" and "Justice for Jasmine" were trending. As the days passed, Karen found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Her once private social media accounts were flooded with comments, many condemning her actions and calling for accountability. Old photos she'd posted, vacation shots, and family gatherings now had a constant stream of negative comments beneath them. Among the multitude of online discussions, people called out Karen's entitlement, privilege, and obvious prejudice, with countless strangers labeling her a symbol of the biases and injustices that so many people of color, especially Black women, encounter in professional environments. This was no longer just a case of one passenger's misconduct. It had become a public forum on prejudice, professional integrity, and respect. Karen's discomfort deepened when her employer, a well-known pharmaceutical company, released a statement acknowledging the incident and announcing that Karen had been placed on indefinite leave pending an investigation. The statement avoided mentioning Karen by name, but everyone knew who it was referring to. This single email was quickly shared on social media, adding fuel to the fire as the online world demanded that Karen face consequences beyond a simple suspension. Karen tried to defend herself at first, crafting a long post on her private Facebook page where she claimed she had felt unsafe due to the turbulence and unfamiliar with Jasmine's qualifications. She argued that she was within her rights to ask questions about the pilot and maintained that she had acted out of a duty to protect herself and other passengers. She framed her actions as a misunderstanding and insisted that the backlash was overblown and unfair. But the post had the opposite effect she had hoped for. Screenshots of her words quickly circulated, and her explanation only fueled the outrage. It was clear to everyone else that Karen was avoiding accountability and refusing to see her actions for what they were: a discriminatory outburst driven by her own biases. Even some of her closest friends and family members distanced themselves, unwilling to condone her behavior. Her sister, who had always been close with Karen, called her soon after the post went viral. "What were you thinking?" Karen, her sister, asked, exasperation evident in her voice. "How could you possibly think any of this was okay?" Karen's frustration bubbled over. "I was protecting myself, all right? You know I'm a nervous flyer." And then they put someone like her in charge. How was I supposed to feel safe? Her sister sighed, her tone softening but laced with disappointment. "Karen, this isn't about your safety. It's about your prejudice. You don't even see it, do you?" The word stung, but Karen couldn't find it within herself to admit fault. Instead, she hung up the phone, feeling isolated and misunderstood, her pride stubbornly refusing to acknowledge the reality of the situation. Meanwhile, Jasmine was experiencing the opposite side of the viral fallout. When she returned to work, she was met with an outpouring of support from her colleagues in the airline. Her superiors took the time to praise her handling of the incident, calling her the embodiment of professionalism and resilience. And while Jasmine had initially hesitated to read the messages on her phone, she soon realized they were filled with encouragement and admiration from friends, family, and even strangers who had been touched by her composure under pressure. Jasmine's colleagues and supervisors were particularly supportive. The airline's vice president, Angela Marshall, personally called Jasmine to express her gratitude. "Captain Rivers, we are beyond grateful for how you handled that situation. You demonstrated the kind of leadership that we're proud to have represent our airline," Angela said. Her voice held a genuine warmth that Jasmine hadn't expected. "Thank you, MS Marshall," Jasmine replied, her voice steady. "I just did what I was trained to do." But Angela wouldn't let it go that easily. "It was more than that, Jasmine. You held yourself with grace in a situation that would have tested anyone's patience. We've decided to nominate you for a special recognition award. You deserve it." Jasmine was humbled by the offer and felt a deep sense of validation. While she hadn't endured Karen's outburst for any reward, the recognition made her feel that her hard work and dedication had not gone unnoticed. This was a moment she could be proud of, not because she had faced Karen's prejudice, but because she had remained true to herself. As the days turned into weeks, Jasmine's story continued to gain traction. News outlets interviewed her, and she shared her experiences openly but professionally, emphasizing that her goal was simply to inspire young women and people of color to pursue their dreams, regardless of the barriers they might face. Her story resonated with a wide audience, touching on themes of resilience, integrity, and quiet strength. One day, Jasmine was contacted by a popular talk show requesting her presence for an interview. She hesitated, unsure if she wanted to bring more public attention to herself, but after speaking with Angela, she decided to accept. The talk show host welcomed Jasmine warmly, the audience applauding as she took her seat. "Captain Rivers," the host began, smiling, "I think I speak for everyone here when I say that we're inspired by your story. Can you tell us a little about how you felt in that moment, facing such intense opposition?" Jasmine took a breath, gathering her thoughts before responding. "Well," she began, "I was focused on my job. It's not easy to ignore personal attacks, but I knew I had a responsibility to my passengers and my crew. It was about staying calm and making sure everyone was safe." The host nodded, visibly moved. "And when you see the support you've received, how does that make you feel?" Jasmine allowed a small smile. "It's incredible. I never expected so many people to reach out and offer encouragement. I hope that this experience can inspire others to stand strong in the face of adversity." The applause was thunderous, and Jasmine felt a surge of gratitude. Her story was no longer just about her personal experience. It had become a symbol of resilience and integrity, a reminder of the strength that comes from standing tall in the face of prejudice. But not everyone was cheering. Karen, watching the interview from her home, was livid. She felt that Jasmine was using the situation to gain sympathy and attention, while she herself was painted as the villain. Her frustration mounted as she saw her world unraveling due to an incident she had dismissed as blown out of proportion. The final blow came when Karen's company officially terminated her employment. The email was curt and formal, citing her disruptive behavior as incompatible with the company's values. Karen was furious, but as she read the letter again, she realized with a sinking feeling that her career as she knew it was over. Her attempts to find another job were met with silence. No company wanted to associate with her now. Her savings began to dwindle, and for the first time in her life, Karen felt the weight of financial insecurity. She moved out of her upscale apartment, choosing a smaller place that she could afford, though the adjustment was a constant reminder of her fall from grace. As Karen's world shrank, Jasmine's continued to expand. People from all walks of life reached out to her, sharing their own stories of resilience and gratitude. Young Black women expressed how much they looked up to her, and pilots from diverse backgrounds thanked her for setting a new standard. Jasmine received invitations to speak at schools and conferences, where she shared her journey and encouraged others to pursue their dreams, regardless of the obstacles they might face. Her speeches were met with admiration, each one inspiring the next generation of young dreamers. But despite her growing success, Jasmine remained humble. She was grateful for every opportunity but kept her focus on her work. For her, flying wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about doing what she loved, about breaking boundaries, and proving that integrity and resilience would always triumph over hatred and prejudice. Months later, as Jasmine walked through an airport terminal, she saw a young girl looking up at her with wide, awe-filled eyes. Jasmine knelt down, smiling at the girl. "Are you a real pilot?" the girl asked, her voice filled with wonder. Jasmine nodded, her smile warm. "Yes, I am. Do you want to be a pilot someday too?" The girl nodded vigorously, her face lighting up. "I do, just like you." Jasmine's heart swelled with pride. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small pin with her airline's logo on it, handing it to the girl. "Well, remember to work hard and believe in yourself. You can be anything you want to be." The girl's mother, watching with tears in her eyes, mouthed a silent thank you to Jasmine. As Jasmine stood and continued on her way, she knew that moments like these were the true rewards of her journey. She had shown others that dreams were within reach, and she had done it on her own terms with dignity and strength. Karen, however, was left to face the reality of her actions. Stripped of the privileges she had once taken for granted, she was forced to confront her own biases, though she resisted change every step of the way. In the end, her downfall became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked prejudice and entitlement. And for Jasmine, the experience became a powerful chapter in her story, a testament to the power of resilience, proving that even in the face of adversity, she could soar higher than anyone had ever expected. The days stretched into weeks, and while the viral incident had quieted in the news cycle, Karen's life had only grown more strained. She avoided public places, aware of the side glances and hushed murmurs whenever she dared to venture out. The weight of her actions hung over her like a storm cloud, and the few people who still stayed in touch did so out of obligation rather than support. Karen's family, once a tight-knit group, distanced themselves. Her parents were embarrassed, and her siblings resented the negative attention she had brought upon them. Her social media posts, once a curated collection of brunch outings and beach vacations, had been set to private in a desperate attempt to control the narrative, but it was too late. A few of her old friends left her messages, either politely scolding her for her behavior or dropping subtle hints that they didn't want to be associated with her anymore. But she clung to her pride, convinced that her actions were justified, even as her life spiraled into isolation. One evening, her phone rang. The caller ID flashed with a familiar name, her childhood best friend, Allison. Hope sparked briefly, and she answered, eager for a sympathetic ear. "Allison, thank goodness," Karen began, but Allison's tone was cold, cutting her off. "Karen, I'm only calling because I feel like I owe you honesty," Allison said. "But after everything that's happened, I can't stand by you. I tried to understand, but what you did was wrong. You humiliated yourself and hurt so many people." Karen's heart sank. "But Allison, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It's all been blown out of proportion. People are twisting my words, making me look like some kind of monster." "You don't understand, do you?" Allison's voice was laced with sadness and frustration. Maybe you didn't mean to hurt anyone, but your actions did, and you still refuse to see it. The line went silent for a moment, and then Allison sighed, the weight of the years they'd known each other evident in her voice. Karen, this is goodbye. I hope someday you'll understand why. The call ended with a quiet click, and Karen was left staring at her phone, the realization sinking in that she was alone, with only her dwindling pride to keep her company. Meanwhile, Jasmine's life had taken a much different path. The incident had become a defining moment in her career, not because she sought fame, but because it had sparked a conversation that resonated with people across the country. She received invitations to speak at events, to join diversity and inclusion panels, and to mentor young women interested in aviation. It was more attention than she had ever anticipated, but she took it in stride, understanding that this was an opportunity to create change. One afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table, going through an inbox overflowing with messages of support. Among them, a note from a young girl named Maya caught her attention. Maya wrote about how she'd always dreamed of becoming a pilot, but had been discouraged by people around her, who told her that piloting was for men. Seeing Jasmine handle the situation with Karen, Maya wrote, had reignited her determination. Jasmine smiled, her heart swelling as she read the girl's message. She quickly typed a reply, sharing words of encouragement and a promise to mentor her if she ever needed advice. These small connections were what drove Jasmine forward, and she was grateful for each one. Jasmine's story continued to inspire many, and soon she found herself being invited to prestigious aviation conferences. At one event, she gave a talk on resilience, professionalism, and the importance of diversity in aviation. Her words reached far beyond the room, with clips of her speech shared widely across social media. She spoke not just about her experience with Karen, but about the countless moments of prejudice she had encountered throughout her career and how she had used them as fuel to succeed. It's not about proving others wrong, she said, her voice steady and clear. It's about proving to yourself that you are capable, worthy, and that you belong. No one can take that away from you. Stand tall, because if you don't, someone else will use their voice to silence you. The audience erupted in applause, and Jasmine left the stage feeling that her message had reached those who needed to hear it most. In the midst of this, Jasmine's family, especially her parents, beamed with pride. Her father, a retired teacher, often said, "We always knew she'd go far." Jasmine's strength and courage had been there since she was a little girl. Her mother, too, was delighted, though she worried about the toll the incident might take on her daughter. But Jasmine reassured them both, grateful for their unwavering support, knowing they'd always been her greatest champions. While Jasmine's success soared, Karen's world continued to shrink. One morning, as she sat at her kitchen table, she opened her laptop to scan for job openings. Despite her education and work experience, her recent history made finding a new job difficult. Any hope she had of landing a similar role evaporated as soon as potential employers searched her name. The viral videos, the countless articles, everything was still there, waiting to remind her and anyone interested of her actions. In her desperation, Karen tried to reach out to her former employer, pleading for another chance. But the human resources director responded politely but firmly, explaining that her behavior had not only breached the company's code of conduct, but had also reflected poorly on their values. Karen realized too late that her insistence on being right had cost her not only her job but her reputation. With no job prospects in sight, Karen was forced to downsize even further, eventually moving into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. Her pride was wounded, but her stubbornness refused to let her see the truth. She still viewed herself as the victim, convinced that the world had conspired to punish her unfairly. But her isolation began to take a toll. The empty messages, the silence from friends and family, all of it weighed heavily on her, though she kept a stubborn front. On some days, as she sat alone, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a lesson she was meant to learn. But the thought would quickly fade, replaced by a simmering anger at the world around her. The people she felt had abandoned her. For Jasmine, however, the journey had only just begun. She became a prominent voice in aviation and diversity advocacy, using her platform to speak out on issues that she knew affected many. Her humility and openness continued to inspire, and she found herself a sought-after guest on podcasts, panels, and interviews where she shared her insights on resilience and integrity. As her influence grew, Jasmine used her position to champion causes she cared about deeply. She advocated for the inclusion of more women and people of color in aviation, mentoring young women like Maya and others who felt out of place in a male-dominated industry. Her ability to connect with people, to share her struggles and triumphs openly, endeared her to many, making her an icon of resilience and determination. One evening, Jasmine's phone rang. It was her former co-pilot, Frank, calling to catch up. "Jasmine," he greeted, his voice full of warmth. "I've been following everything. You're practically a legend now." She laughed, feeling a little bashful. "I wouldn't go that far, Frank, but thank you." They reminisced about their flights together, and Frank praised her for how far she'd come. Before they hung up, he left her with words that echoed in her heart. "You've done something special, Jasmine. You turned an ugly situation into something beautiful. Not many people can do that." After their call ended, Jasmine reflected on his words. She knew her journey was about more than her own success. It was about opening doors for those who would come after her. And she was ready to continue, her eyes set on the future with renewed hope. Karen, meanwhile, remained in her small apartment, watching the world pass by without her. The respect she once commanded, the social circle she belonged to, all of it was a distant memory. Her story had become a lesson to many, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked entitlement and prejudice. And while she clung to her pride, deep down, a small part of her wondered if she'd ever find redemption, though her stubborn heart refused to seek it. In the end, the incident on Flight 294 became more than just a viral moment. It was a testament to the resilience of those who dared to rise above prejudice and hatred. Jasmine's strength became a beacon of hope, a reminder to anyone facing adversity that they, too, could soar in the face of hardship. And as for Karen, her downfall served as a reminder of the cost of entitlement and the value of humility, lessons that, for now, were left unlearned. The months following Karen's apology were transformative in subtle but significant ways. She had come face to face with the painful truth about herself and had begun a journey toward accepting her faults. Though she had reached out to Jasmine with her heartfelt message, she didn't expect forgiveness. Karen knew now that this journey was hers alone to make, and each step would be a private reckoning rather than a plea for public redemption. Her new, more modest life had forced her to confront many hard realities. Simple luxuries she had once taken for granted, weekend brunches with friends, spontaneous shopping trips, the easy camaraderie of colleagues, were now distant memories. She'd lost the comfort of her social circles, leaving her with only herself and the need to find a new purpose. The introspection that had begun during her sensitivity training continued, evolving into a personal mission to understand not only her biases but the broader forces that shaped them. One afternoon, Karen found herself sitting alone at the local library, something she hadn't done since she was a child. She had been hesitant to step into public spaces, her reputation preceding her, but here, among strangers lost in their books and studies, she felt an odd sense of freedom. No one recognized her here, and she used this anonymity to delve into books on social justice, empathy, and racial history. At first, reading these books was uncomfortable, as they forced her to confront thoughts and truths she had long ignored, but as she read on, the discomfort gave way to curiosity, then to understanding. Gradually, Karen started to take small steps toward rebuilding her life. She volunteered at a local community center, helping to organize food drives and clean up efforts in underprivileged neighborhoods. She went not out of a need to prove anything, but because she felt a quiet compulsion to contribute something positive. Through these acts, she hoped to balance the harm she'd caused with small deeds that might make a difference, even if only to herself. One day, while working at the community center, she found herself in conversation with a young girl named Alicia. Alicia was bright, with eyes full of curiosity, and she confided to Karen that she dreamed of becoming a pilot. Karen listened, her heart softening as the girl shared her ambitions and talked about the challenges she anticipated. "My mom says it's hard for people like us," Alicia said, her voice small but determined. "But I want to fly planes one day, just like Captain Jasmine. She's my hero." Karen's heart skipped a beat, the mention of Jasmine's name striking her like a sudden gust of wind. She smiled gently, hiding the pang of regret that surfaced, and asked Alicia about her dreams, giving the girl her full attention. In that moment, Karen realized that Jasmine's impact had stretched far beyond their encounter, and she felt a strange sense of pride knowing that she, too, had witnessed that strength firsthand. For Jasmine, life continued to flourish. Her career had reached new heights, with numerous speaking engagements, honors, and even a national magazine feature celebrating her accomplishments as a trailblazer in aviation. She embraced the role of mentor with grace, frequently volunteering at local schools and sharing her experiences with young students who dreamed of following in her footsteps. Her schedule was busier than ever, yet she felt grounded, her heart fueled by the opportunity to inspire others. One day, Jasmine was preparing to speak at a leadership conference. As she reviewed her speech, a familiar face appeared in the audience, her mother, whom Jasmine hadn't expected to see there that day. Her mother's eyes were bright with pride as she watched Jasmine approach the stage, a quiet reminder of the support that had carried her through her journey. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jasmine began, her voice steady, "I stand before you not just as a pilot, but as someone who has faced challenges and overcome them. We're all capable of resilience, and if there's one thing I hope to share with you today, it's this: no dream is too high. No barrier too strong to keep you from your purpose." Her words carried the wisdom she'd gained from years of perseverance and the grace she had found in navigating obstacles with courage. As the crowd erupted in applause, Jasmine's gaze met her mother's, a shared moment of understanding passing between them. She knew that her mother's pride was rooted in more than just her career; it was in the strength Jasmine had shown and the values she'd upheld. After the conference, Jasmine was approached by an older woman who had been in the audience. The woman's face was gentle, lined with age, and her voice held a softness that resonated with warmth. "Captain Rivers," she said, extending a hand, "I want to thank you for sharing your story. I grew up in a time when women, especially women of color, were often told to stay in the background. Seeing you here today, leading with such grace and strength, it gives me hope that we've come far, and that future generations will go even further." Jasmine shook her hand, deeply moved. The woman's words reminded her of her purpose, not only as a pilot but as a symbol of progress. She felt a renewed sense of commitment to her journey, knowing that her story was a small part of a much larger movement. As the conference wound down, Jasmine received a message from Maya, the young girl she had been mentoring. Maya had passed her first set of flight exams, and her excitement spilled over in her text, thanking Jasmine for the encouragement that had helped her overcome her own self-doubt. Reading Maya's message, Jasmine felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond any professional accolade. She had helped someone believe in themselves just as her own mentors had done for her. It was a legacy that she cherished, one that reminded her that true success was found in lifting others up. Months later, Karen had taken further steps toward understanding the impact of her actions. She continued her work at the community center, finding quiet solace in the simple acts of kindness she performed there. She no longer sought recognition or validation. Instead, she was focused on finding a peace within herself that she had once thought impossible. One afternoon, she was sorting through donations when a news report caught her eye. It featured Jasmine, who was being awarded a prestigious aviation medal in honor of her contributions to the field and her role as an advocate for diversity and inclusion. The reporter praised Jasmine's achievements, highlighting her journey and the resilience she had shown. As Karen watched, she felt a complex mix of emotions: admiration, regret, and a longing for redemption. Though she knew she couldn't undo the past, she felt a small measure of peace, knowing that Jasmine had achieved so much despite the obstacles she had faced. The report served as a reminder of the path she herself was on: a journey towards self-awareness and humility. Karen decided to reach out to the community center's director, proposing a mentorship program for young girls interested in aviation. She wanted to offer her support to those who, like Alicia, dreamed of reaching heights they might not yet believe possible. The director agreed, and Karen found herself feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The first meeting of the mentorship program was small, with only a few girls in attendance. But as Karen shared stories of her own experiences, leaving out her more recent missteps, she found a strange comfort in encouraging these young minds to believe in themselves. She spoke about the importance of perseverance, of pushing through adversity, and although she felt unworthy to be offering advice, the sincerity of her words resonated with the girls. Alicia, the young girl with dreams of piloting, was in attendance. She listened intently, her eyes shining with excitement as Karen spoke about resilience and the importance of believing in one's own worth. Karen noticed the girl's enthusiasm and felt a pang of remorse, realizing that she had once stood in the way of someone like Alicia simply because of her own ignorance. But now, in this small way, she hoped to make a positive impact, to add a small light to the future she had once tried to dim. For Jasmine, life had come full circle. She had built a career she was proud of, inspired others, and found peace within herself. Her journey had been one of trials and triumphs, of moments where she had to stand tall, despite the weight of prejudice. And as she moved forward, she did so with a sense of purpose that extended far beyond her own ambitions. On a calm evening, Jasmine received a letter in the mail. It was from a young girl she had spoken to years ago at one of her first school visits. The girl, now a young woman studying aerospace engineering, wrote to thank Jasmine for sparking a passion in her that had carried her through her studies. "You once told me to never let anyone tell me I don't belong," the letter read. "Those words kept me going, even when things got tough. Thank you for being my role model. I hope to make a difference just like you." As Jasmine folded the letter, she felt a quiet pride that was far more meaningful than any award. She had left a legacy of courage, one that would ripple through generations. Her story had become a beacon of hope, and she knew that others would continue the journey she had started. Jasmine and Karen's paths would likely never cross again, but the impact of their encounter remained. Karen had found a measure of redemption in her quiet acts of service, while Jasmine had become a symbol of resilience and strength. Each woman in her own way had faced the consequences of that fateful day on Flight 294. For Jasmine, it had been a chapter of growth, and for Karen, a painful yet transformative reckoning. As they both moved forward, they carried with them the lessons they had learned of humility, of perseverance, and of the unbreakable strength that comes from facing the truth within themselves. Months had passed since the incident on Flight 294, but the memory remained fresh in the public's mind. The online outrage had quieted, yet Karen's actions were far from forgotten. For Karen, life was an unending series of consequences that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her former social circles, once filled with familiar faces and casual friends, had all but closed their doors to her, and she was left with only the company of her own thoughts and the bitter taste of isolation. Karen's situation took a more serious turn when she received a court summons. The airline, as well as the assaulted flight attendant, had decided to press charges for disruptive behavior, with the possibility of her actions being considered a minor assault. Karen's heart sank as she read through the legal documents, unable to comprehend that her single moment of anger had led to this. The weight of the consequences settled on her shoulders, but her pride, though dented, still held her back from truly accepting any fault. In the days leading up to her hearing, Karen tried to prepare herself, convincing herself that she'd only need to present a case explaining that her actions were motivated by fear. She hired a lawyer who encouraged her to admit to some remorse, to show a willingness to make amends, but Karen resisted the advice, feeling as though it would be a betrayal of her pride. She remained defensive, holding on to her belief that she had merely been acting out of concern and should not be held liable for her behavior. As the day of her court appearance arrived, Karen entered the courthouse with her lawyer by her side, her once confident gait reduced to an uneasy shuffle. Her eyes scanned the small group of onlookers who had gathered, a few of whom whispered as she passed. She avoided their gazes, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of shame and stubborn defiance. When it was her turn to testify, Karen stood before the judge, shifting her weight uncomfortably. She fidgeted with her hands as she tried to present herself with the poise she once had, but under the scrutiny of the judge and the few spectators in the room, she struggled to maintain her composure. Her lawyer had suggested she speak briefly about the incident, offering a genuine apology, but when Karen began, her prideful nature took over. She stumbled through her testimony, using words that felt forced and hollow. She mentioned her anxiety as a flyer, her discomfort with the situation, and the unfortunate misunderstandings that had led to her actions. The judge listened patiently but showed little sympathy. When it came time for the flight attendant to speak, her words were simple but powerful. She described the fear and disrespect she had felt as Karen's rage had escalated on that fateful flight, emphasizing how Karen's behavior had endangered not only the crew but every passenger on board. The flight attendant's testimony resonated with everyone in the room, her words a stark reminder of the far-reaching impact of Karen's actions. Karen's lawyer whispered for her to remain silent, to avoid making matters worse, but as she listened to the flight attendant's words, her anger flared once again. She felt targeted, humiliated, and she fought the urge to lash out. But the reality of her position was inescapable. She had lost everything, and the walls were closing in. The judge handed down her sentence, a substantial fine and several hours of community service, with the added stipulation of attending a sensitivity training course. Karen's shoulders slumped as she realized this was only the beginning. Her lawyer had warned her that rebuilding her reputation would require a long, painful journey, and for the first time she began to feel the weight of her actions fully sink in. The sensitivity training was an eye-opening experience, albeit a deeply uncomfortable one for Karen. The sessions were held in a modest building downtown, where a small group of attendees gathered each week. Most were there for reasons not unlike Karen's, people who had made mistakes and were now facing the consequences. At first, Karen sat silently in the back, refusing to participate, resenting each session. She didn't believe she belonged there, surrounded by people she considered actual offenders. But as the sessions continued, Karen was forced to listen to others share their stories, people from various backgrounds and circumstances. They spoke of regrets, of mistakes made in moments of anger or ignorance, and of the pain they felt in their hearts as they recognized the harm they'd caused. One woman, a former teacher, shared her story of making a racist comment during a moment of frustration and how it had cost her job, her friends, and her self-respect. Hearing these stories stirred something in Karen. She saw in these people fragments of herself, the regret she fought so hard to ignore, the resentment she'd held close, and buried deep down, the guilt she had tried to avoid acknowledging. But each session brought her face to face with her own reflection, forcing her to confront the person she had become. In one session, the trainer asked the group to write a letter of apology to those they had wronged, whether they chose to send it or not. Karen stared at the blank piece of paper, her mind flooded with defensive thoughts, but eventually she began to write. At first, her words were forced, her sentences hollow, but as she continued, her resentment began to unravel, replaced by a slow, reluctant acknowledgement of her actions. I didn't think about how my actions would affect others. I was wrong, and I am sorry. As she penned the final words, a tear fell onto the page. She didn't know if she'd ever truly understand the harm she'd caused, but for the first time, she began to feel a glimmer of remorse. She folded the letter, unsure of what to do with it, but kept it as a reminder of the path she now knew she needed to take. While Karen was starting her journey toward redemption, Jasmine's life continued to thrive. She had recently been named as the keynote speaker for an international aviation conference, and her reputation had only grown. People in the industry respected her, not only for her skills but for her resilience and grace. She had become an unofficial mentor to many young women and men who sought to break through the barriers of prejudice and inequality. On the day of the conference, Jasmine arrived to find a packed room with people eager to hear her speak. Her speech was titled "Rising Above," a personal reflection on her journey, her values, and the strength it took to persevere in an industry that had often overlooked people like her. She recounted not only her career challenges but the lessons she had learned about grace, courage, and the importance of lifting others up along the way. In the face of adversity, you always have a choice, she told the audience, her voice steady but filled with emotion. You can let it make you bitter, or you can let it make you stronger. I chose the latter, and I hope you will too. The applause was thunderous, and Jasmine felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond her professional achievements. She had reached a point in her career where her journey had the power to inspire others, and she knew that was a privilege she would never take for granted. After the speech, a young woman approached her, her eyes filled with admiration. "Captain Rivers," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm studying to be a pilot, and your story, it means everything to me. There were times I thought about giving up, but hearing your story reminds me why I started." Jasmine smiled, moved by the young woman's words. "I know it's not always easy, but remember that you're never alone. Keep going, and don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." The woman nodded, her determination renewed. Jasmine's words had become a lifeline to so many, and for each person she inspired, she felt a deep sense of purpose. Back in her small apartment, Karen wrestled with her newfound remorse. The sensitivity training had awakened emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel before, and she found herself questioning her actions more deeply than ever. She couldn't undo what she'd done, but perhaps, she thought, there was a way to move forward. On impulse, she searched for Jasmine's public profile, and after a long hesitation, she typed out a message. The words came slowly, but she was determined to reach out, even if it was only to take a small step toward accountability. "Captain Rivers, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I'm truly sorry. I am starting to see the harm I caused, and I regret that it took me so long to realize it. Thank you for handling the situation with more grace than I ever could." Karen hesitated before hitting send, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't know if Jasmine would respond or even read it, but for the first time she felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. Jasmine saw the message later that evening. She read it carefully, feeling a surge of emotions as she processed Karen's words. Jasmine had long since moved on, her journey no longer defined by that day, but seeing the message reminded her of how far they both had come. Though she chose not to reply, she hoped that Karen would find the redemption she sought. For Jasmine, forgiveness wasn't necessary. She had already found peace within herself. And as she continued to inspire others, she knew her legacy would be one of resilience, grace, and the power to rise above.